Our next speaker is Vanessa Wells. Vanessa is a political philosopher, ethicist, educator, and activist. She's associate professor of philosophy in George Washington University, DC. Her research touches on various topics in moral, social, and political philosophy, as well as 19th century German philosophy, with a special focus on Marx and the philosophy of race. Among her recent publications in this neighborhood are the appetizingly titled "And He Ate Jim Crow: Racist Ideology as False Consciousness." It's an essay from 2021. And "What Could It Mean to Say That Capitalism Causes Sexism and Racism" from 2018. She also has a forthcoming book in Oxford University Press, Marx, titled Marx's Ethical Vision. For the main course now.
Great, thank you. Great. What I'm going to do is a combination of speaking from notes, and I'm also going to read to you for a few moments from the book itself. I usually do not read talks, but I am going to do some of that today. So, Marx wrote that the philosophers have merely interpreted the world. The point, however, is to change it. And I think that it's, if he were to show up today, he might be maybe not so surprised, but certainly disappointed to find that it's now fairly controversial whether the job of philosophers is even actually to interpret the world at all, right? And the study of ethics is particularly susceptible to this, right? We see it in all kinds of domains, this sort of embrace of skepticism, of retreat from the project of making objective claims about the real nature of being with a capital B, right? It's regarded as sort of overly ambitious. And this is especially true in ethics, right? The ethics is particularly susceptible to this. There's a tendency to focus on the normative, as one does in ethics, but to do it in a way that particularly front loads abstract contemplation of ethical principles and ideals to the near total exclusion of evaluating what is, right? Of thinking about what it is that actually exists. And so even many of us will, of course, be familiar with the notion that there is some sort of uncrossable gap between what is and what ought to be, such that what is maybe even entirely irrelevant to the project of ethics. It's not only tempting because of our philosophical and ideological commitments and trainings, but it's tempting and safe, because there's a way of reading Marx, and I think this is a real danger when thinking about the question of Marx and ethics. And I'm just going to say I use ethics and morality interchangeably. So if I go back and forth, I don't want to. It doesn't mean anything, right? There's especially that danger when thinking about Marx and ethics, because it's safe. It's certainly much more comfortable, probably a lot better for your career, if you think of Marx as someone who is simply giving different kinds of ethical advice that's on the table, putting out a vision of a kind of communist future that we might just freely choose, that is completely divorced from thinking about the realities of class conflict, thinking about the role of the working class as a historical agent with the possibility of imposing its interests as a class onto society. Much better to sort of move away and retreat from that kind of analysis and instead think of Marx as somebody who advocates lots of nice things. So Marx wants us all to have our subsistence needs met. Well, doesn't everyone, right? And so it essentially denatures Marx, right? Makes him more or less indistinguishable from any other set of good advice or ethical dreaming. And it's clear that that's not what Marx is up to, right? He's specifically opposed to that kind of discourse or that kind of conversation, and is very clear in his commitment that engaging in that kind of abstract dreaming, what he might term utopianism, is worse than useless, right? And perhaps even completely counterproductive to the project of actually ever realizing the improved state of affairs represented in that kind of picture. So that's one place where that temptation can come from, but there's another. There's a temptation to reduce Marxism to a set of ethical recommendations, and that can come from a concern about Marx's philosophy of history, one that he has in common with Hegel. Sorry, I'm sort of Hegelian Marxist here. So the concern is, well, is history really the sort of thing that admits of scientific reasoning in the first place? If it is, then that means, among many other things, that we might expect to be able to make certain kinds of ontological claims about what kinds of things exist in history. This is a historiographical matter that is becoming more salient as more and more you find academics trying to think about the nature of fascism, for example. And in history, it is a well-trodden ground where there's the question comes up, well, we had this one thing happen in this case, but is it really the same thing that's happening in these other cases, right? That's a question about categories. That's a question about the nature of things that exist in history, right? And moreover, the reason that we engage in categorization in science is because we think that if we know what kind of thing a thing is, we'll be able to make certain predictions about it, because there might be scientific laws that apply to it and to things of its kind. And so those are exactly the kinds of questions that are at stake in philosophy of history and historiographical debates. And for the most part, well, I shouldn't say for the most part, but a huge swath, anyway, of the academy has determined that the answer is no, right? That to do history scientifically is to stick to the facts, describe specific, discrete incidents, people, happenings, but not attempt to bring them under any larger historical categories. That is related, of course, to a larger question that comes back to the issue of ethics, right, and thinking about ethics, because so I have this book that's forthcoming, and there's lots of debates, conversations that problematize the question of whether Marx can be said to have had an ethical perspective, or whether it can be reasonable to say that there's a ethical content in Marx's theory. And one place that that kind of doubt is generated is in a very familiar problem of the relationship between freedom and determinism. Now, I am going to rehearse the familiar problem, but so that to sort of situate things, but this will be very, very familiar to many of you, right? So the worry, of course, is that morality and our moral practices, our habits of assigning praise and blame, of making determinations about who was responsible for what, that those rely on a conception of human freedom that might be incompatible with a law-like character of history and of the universe. So the concern, of course, is, well, we want to be able to say truly of an action that it was this person's action, that it was they who were the author of that action, that they caused it, that they are the reason that it happened. And we think that if we're going to assign them blame or praise for that action, we want to establish that. But if it turns out, right, that there are deterministic laws that actually compelled this behavior, made it the case, guaranteed in advance that they would behave in the way they did, then it's not some of our moral practices, all of our moral practices will have to go out the wayside, at least our practices of moral judgment about human beings and their actions. So what I want to, I'll tell you what are the next three things that are going to happen. So I want to tell you a little bit, a lot, about how I think there are resources in Marx to resolve this dialectic of freedom and determinism that is a philosophical problem that is has a certain kind of intransigence in our literature about it. In doing that, I want to show why it is necessary to preserve the dialectical nature of Marx's thought and not abandon it. And of course, there's a history in Marx's interpretation of abandoning it. In the Anglophone tradition, analytical Marxism is by far one of the most influential readings in terms of the reception of Marx in the academy, where you had no bullshit Marxism, right, which is Marxism without the dialectics. But you need it. You need it to make sense of Marx, and you need it in order to get the insights that Marx provides for us about how to think about these seemingly vexing theoretical problems. And lastly, I'll say some speculative things, but I'll leave that as a surprise for now. So. And sorry, I haven't been keeping track of time at all. How am I doing on? 30 minutes. I have 30 minutes left. Great, perfect. That's just enough time. So, Marx on freedom and determinism. And someone asked for this in the last Q&A, so this is perfect. If Marx's and Engels's materialist conception of history entails that human behavior is strictly deterministic, and that socialism is guaranteed by the inexorable march of history, then it would seem to follow that human beings are not and could not be free in the way that the practice of moral judgment generally presupposes them to be. When we deem a person to be morally responsible, that is, to be the appropriate object of moral praise or blame, we generally presume that they have, in some deep sense, chosen to act as they did. We presuppose that they are the author of the event in question. Strict determinism has it that actions which might seem at first blush to be mine, in some deep sense were in fact fatalistically preordained by circumstances preceding even my very existence. My decisions would for that reason then be quite out of my control and not properly attributable to me after all. A Marxist moral theory owes to its hearers an explanation of what kind of determinism historical materialism does entail, and an account of how this can be compatible with the human emancipation Marx repeatedly identifies as the chief aim of socialist praxis. If Marx's economic determinism requires that individual human beings always only behave just as the laws of history unavoidably compel them to, then moral praise and blame is no more appropriately applied to them than it is to inanimate objects dropped from heights. Numerous interpreters of Marx, presuming that historical materialism does entail a strict mechanistic determinism, have gone on to reason that Marx's theory is therefore inhospitable to morality. However, historical materialism does not entail this. Now, we might here be appropriately reminded of Marx's oft-quoted observation that men make their own history, but they do not make it as they please. They do not make it under self-selected circumstances, but under circumstances existing already, given and transmitted from the past. What is meant by that famous line from Marx's 1852 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte? For one thing, it expresses that human social existence is the product of human labor. And as such, it is susceptible to human intervention aimed at making it over and redirecting its course. I argue this principle is absolutely central to Marx's moral thought. Now, any given individual human being, while alienated from their human powers, has relatively little in the way of genuine authorship over their actions, or even their entire lives, but not none. By contrast, at the level of the species, it can be said that humanity truly is the author of its actions and of the course of its own history. And this is true even if only unconsciously so, and in an attenuated fashion, prior to the realization of full human emancipation in fully developed communism. Both Marx and Engels insist on multiple occasions that humanity itself is a human product. However, humanity, as you keen listeners will have noticed, right, is an abstraction. To satisfy ourselves with the explanation that humanity is free in the desired sense, even while individual human beings are not, would be to content ourselves with a resolution of the antagonism between freedom and determinism that occurs only in the realm of thought. Yet our aim is not merely to discover a clever solution to a philosophical puzzle. It is rather to ascertain how this kind of self-making can be manifested by individual human beings, so that a given individual might more truly be said to be the author of her actions. As such, the discussion of freedom and determinism in Marx is highly interwoven with our understanding of Marx's concept of the individual. Here I'll set the stage for understanding the reconciliation of freedom and determinism in Marx's thought, and an explanation of the relationship between freedom and determinism in Marx's thought, and that of the relationship between individual and society, outline in parallel the same historical process through which human emancipation becomes realized. In order to help orient our discussion, it's useful to say a bit about how Marx's proffered resolution to the antagonism between freedom and determinism relates to the positions that many will recognize as familiar from traditional analytic philosophy. Incompatibilism is the name given to views that hold freedom to be untenable in the presence of determinism. Compatibilist views maintain that this pair can coexist. If we were to map Marx's positions onto analytical philosophical perspectives on the matter, then we'd say that Marx is a compatibilist about freedom and determinism. But that mapping must remain purely heuristic, because if taken too literally, it will obscure what Marx takes to be two of the most important distinctions between historical materialism and the worldviews he associates with ideologically bourgeois approaches. Namely, one must not overlook the deep extent to which, on a Marxist approach to thinking through freedom, agency, morality, and necessity, the precise relationship between freedom and determinism can be given no static or permanent description. The antagonism is one that shifts dynamically over the course of human history, with each side of the contradiction conditioning and transforming the development of the other. There is no fixed and final answer to the question of how human freedom can exist in the presence of deterministic laws. This relationship is not a puzzle to be contemplated in thought, but a problem to be worked out concretely in the course of history. What's more, the impetus for this development is provided by human action, itself both free and determined. I use the term dialectical compatibilism to invoke both the ways in which Marx's approach to freedom and determinism is in conversation with traditional analyses of this pairing, and also the ways in which it is fundamentally divergent from them. This position moves beyond the views typically arrayed along the axis of determinist or libertarian, compatibilist or incompatibilist. Much of the confusion surrounding Marx's positions on the relationship between freedom and determinism stems from the fact that for Marx, this is an evolving and historically contingent relationship. One cannot issue timeless, universal statements about the degree to which external determining factors influence human behavior, or concerning the extent to which this behavior is the free and voluntary action of human beings. Now, it's true that humans have acted under conditions that, speaking for the most part, they have not chosen. Yet in so doing, they also bring those conditions increasingly under their conscious control. As humans develop greater control over their circumstances, they correspondingly broaden their capacity for free, self-directed agency. In this way, for Marx, freedom and determinism conflict with one another much as they do on the most well-known incompatibilist accounts. Yet, deterministic economic forces also function as preconditions for human freedom and figure into the story of how that freedom comes about. Marx's picture is not of a compatibility between freedom and determinism that holds true in precisely the same way for all humans across time and space, but rather of a human freedom that grows, spurred in part by the operation of deterministic laws. In human activity, freedom and determinism are mutually conditioned in ways that produce their ever greater dialectical compatibility, unfolding across time. And so what I'm doing in that passage, essentially essentially the diagnosis I'm offering, right, of some of the intractability of our conversations about freedom and determinism is essentially a failure to recognize the interpenetration of the categories, right? An inability to appreciate the sense in which a thing might contain its opposite, which develops in such a manner as to abolish, right, what was. These categories and the relationship between them is only properly understood if we think about how it is that human beings themselves are constantly producing and reproducing the relationship between their own freedom and the deterministic external forces, right, throughout their activity over time. So to give an example of this, or to put this in a different context, this is true for Marx about communism itself, right, and brings us back to my initial warning, right, about the pitfalls of reducing communism to a kind of ethical advice, because it is, in addition to saying that they don't preach morality at all, Marx also says, along with his collaborator Friedrich Engels, that communism is not an ideal to which society must adjust itself, right? It's an already existing movement abolishing the current state of things. Now, it can seem mysterious, maybe, to try to think through how it is that the kind of human emancipation that Marx is describing as a already unfolding process could emerge out of the same circumstances, capitalism, that he describes as stultifying, limiting, alienating. But if we think about the ways that our collective human social activity, now and in the past, right, unwittingly often, right, unbeknownst to us, nonetheless produces circumstances within which we can see more, right, and interact with one another in different ways, and take greater control, right, of what appears to us, or what earlier presents itself to us as sort of external laws, right, having this inexorable deterministic form. So, okay, so it's 4:26, so it's time for me to get to the really, I was like, and then I'll say speculative things, as though that's not all I've been doing, but so why does Marx say that the communists do not preach morality at all? Why is it that in the Communist Manifesto, Marx readily absorbs the charge that the communists seek to abolish morality? And I think it's because for Marx, morality is, in two important senses, already abolished, right? Already done away with under capitalism. Now, one way is sort of obvious, right? Namely that capitalists don't allow morality or moral considerations to interfere with their calculations for the next quarter, right? So just in the same way that the proletariat represents a class that already has private property abolished because they don't have any, right? Similarly, they live under conditions that are determined by the naked rule of capital, not by what's ethical, not by some concern with the human. So that's one sense, relatively straightforward. The other, so first, that morality is abolished for the working class. The other is that morality is already in the process of being abolished in the working class. That it is the case that if we were to articulate some ethical imperative for our time, the highest ethical imperative is precisely to achieve the victory of working people over capital. It's fully coincident. So the ethical imperative, such as it is already fully coincident with the interests of workers under capital. And so morality does not exist as an external command for the working class. It's not a call to sacrifice their interests. It is directly the theory of proletarian revolution itself. And this is what he means when he says at various points that the working class cannot emancipate itself without emancipating all of humanity. When he says that the working class has no particular wrong committed against it, but only general wrong that is wrong against all human beings. So since their interests are already directly identical with the interests of humanity, there's no preaching morality, right, to the working class, right, or to working class movements. There's describing the existing state of relations of power between the working class and the class that it must oppose. And there's making a kind of empirical determinations about what kinds of actions are likely to aid the working class in that struggle. But there's no separate distinctively moral reasoning aside from that would articulate something that is distinct from the working class's own struggle to realize its greater agency and to realize democratic control over the socially necessary resources. But the working class isn't the only class, obviously. And again, for this, you have to think dialectically. So the bourgeoisie exists, right? And for the capitalist class, these kinds of commands, right, absolutely do take the abstract form of external commands. And unsurprisingly, commands that capitalists generally find pretty uncompelling, and commands with argumentative justifications for which capitalists typically find pretty unconvincing. So I think it's right to say then that we have a situation where morality is both already abolished for the working class, right? Even though at the same time, those principles, right, also have an existence as external moral, distinctively moral commands for the capitalist class, ones that cannot be justified by reference to the capitalist class's own conditions of existence, which is why we have Marx saying, for example, in the manifesto, that to bring about communism would require despotic inroads on private property, right? Not because he's a despot, right, but because he's ironically pointing out that these are measures that can never be justified according to capitalist forms of thought. So here's the really speculative thing I want to say, which is that some of the intractability of these bourgeois debates about the relationship between freedom and determinism itself reflects capitalist anxieties that having unleashed, right, having through the industrialization of production, having unleashed creative and agential human powers never before known, it could not do so without also producing a revolutionary class, right? One that strives to relate to the bourgeoisie as an intractable, overwhelming, and determining force, right? And that can relate to it as nothing else because it cannot justify itself by reference to forms of thought that a bourgeois perspective can recognize as reasonable, right, as rational. So human freedom itself, right, the sort of real human emancipation that Marx is talking about, his vision of communism, of human beings living free from the domination of one over the other. This is exactly the sort of thing, this genuine human freedom can't be recognized from a bourgeois perspective as freedom. And that is precisely because that perspective is itself alienated and unable to recognize the humanity of the proletariat. It relates to the proletariat as a real element in human social reality that confronts the bourgeoisie as an immutable law. And so the thought is that there's no way, right, sort of from within this capitalist perspective, right, to to sort of notice, right, what it is that actually instantiates human freedom, because the thing that does instantiate the real practical resolution to this contradiction between freedom and determinism, namely the working class, always confronts the capitalist as a force, right, to be reckoned with, and a force that seeks to make its interests general, right? So there are there's hints of this all over the place, right? But one place that is particularly relevant for us is thinking about Capital in Volume 1, where Marx describes, first of all, the irrationality of capital and the inability to respond to existential threats. So he writes the following. He says, "Capital that has such good reasons for denying the sufferings of the legions of workers that surround it is in practice moved as much and as little by the sight of the coming degradation and final depopulation of the human race as by the probable fall of the earth into the sun. In every stock-jobbing swindle, everyone knows that sometime or other the crash must come, but everyone hopes that it may fall on the head of his neighbor, after he himself has caught the shower of gold and placed it in safety. Après moi le déluge is the watchword of every capitalist and every capitalist nation. Hence, capital is reckless of the health or length of life of the laborer, unless under compulsion from society. To the outcry as to the physical and mental degradation, the premature death, the torture of overwork, it answers, ought these to trouble us since they increase our profits? But looking at things as a whole, all this does not indeed depend on the good or ill will of the individual capitalist. Free competition brings out the inherent laws of capitalist production in the shape of external coercive laws having power over every individual capitalist." Now, several important themes are expressed in this passage. First, far from leading inexorably toward a communist future, capital, and of course the capitalist class taken as a whole, looks impassively at the coming degradation and final depopulation of the human race. This prospect is treated as though it were merely some regrettable, but ultimately unalterable natural certainty. Relating this to the contemporary situation, we can consider the baleful shoulder shrugging that typifies the attitudes of many of today's world governments towards impending and already unfolding catastrophes, such as global climate change. It is only under compulsion from society that humanity can be taken off of its collision course with the destructive effects of capitalism. The conscious and active intervention of the masses into politics and into world history is ultimately all that stands between us and this final depopulation. We can see that Marx believed this from his own political engagement with the workers' movement, not to mention his lifelong dedication to investigating how the social and economic gains of capitalism can be preserved and subsumed in a higher stage of social development, and his conviction that just this ought to be done and could only be done by the active masses. Marx prioritized the majority of society acting in the interest of the majority of society. Second, we see mentioned in this passage the way in which the free competition of capitalist society reveals itself to be unfreedom in practice, taking on, quote, the shape of external coercive laws having power over every individual capitalist. Now, one important question to be asked of those who see here some ground to label Marx a crude economic determinist and therefore an amoralist is whether they can really doubt that capitalists generally do act in ways designed to preserve and multiply their capital. Looking at things as a whole, the capitalist, no matter how noble he might be in his heart of hearts, whether his will be good or ill, must extract as much labor as possible at as little cost to himself as possible. This remains true if he wishes to compete in the marketplace and to remain a capitalist at all. And it's this general tendency of people in capitalist society to defend their economic interests that makes it possible to predict that class struggle between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, whose interests are in conflict with one another, will take place. However, it does not by any means guarantee which side will win out in the battle. So I'm going to give a couple of minutes here of wrapping up and concluding. So what I want to point out here, right, is, the fact that Marx identifies these categories of human beings under capitalism, right, and then makes claims about how human beings are likely to behave given which category they're in, is often cited, right, as evidence of his strict determinism, of his complete incapacity to make sense of the existence of human agency, right? But that is true only if you are beholden to an undialectical way of thinking about the relationship between freedom and determinism. If you think it's the case that there are historical and economic laws, right, the kind of law-likeness of society, right, of class society in particular, and of capitalism to be very, very specific, what we want to say then is that those forces, right, produce circumstances that themselves create the conditions for a proliferation of human powers, for a unleashing, right, of human capacity to know and interpret the world. And that these capacities and powers are produced precisely on the basis of the law-likeness of class society. So that this is part of what it means to say that class society and that capitalism in particular possesses its own opposite, which is already existing and already in the process of abolishing this enslaving, degrading, alienating society. As human beings develop their powers, right, and as we develop more and more ways of interacting with the world and with one another, we also, in that same process, of course, transform the world and transform ourselves so that we continue to have more, right, capacities to interact with the world in a way that is governed by our reason, right, and governed by our best theories about the world and about what form of life we wish to have. So that it is mistaken to think that we have, that by describing a law-likeness in history, that we are then somehow foreclosing the possibility of the real kind of individual human agency and social human emancipation that Marx envisions in communism. It is precisely the fact that workers are drawn into battle with capitalists that produces the possibility of greater freedom for individuals and a unleashing of our creative potentials. So I'm going to stop there, and I'm really looking forward to Q&A, as I just gave a kind of pressy in a way, and so I'm really looking forward to elaborating further and hearing your thoughts. Thank you. And now I sit.
Yeah, okay, so we're going to take some questions. Christophe.
Thanks so much, Vanessa. So when people talk about the compatibility or not of freedom and determinism, what they really mean is always free will and determinism. Right? And so I'm making that distinction because I want to pose my question in a particular way, which is there a need for free will or freedom conceived as free will in communism at all? So one might think that free will conceived in this sort of juridical derived way from, and you mentioned praise and blame and so on. So praise and blame are extremely important in the society that we live in because we're constantly needing to praise and blame people for various things. So there's a particular kind of conception of freedom that you might have that's associated with free will, right? Choosing one way rather than the other, being the author of one's actions and then subjecting oneself to the pleasure of being punished and so on. But you might think of, so the reason I made the terminological distinction is you might think of freedom in a different way. So someone like Spinoza, for example, doesn't think of freedom in terms of free will in that way, and so he doesn't think that there's an issue about compatibility because to be free is to be something like a maximally powerful agent or something like that. Quite at odds with the sort of free will conception. So my question is there even an issue at all about the compatibility of freedom with determinism in communism if it's conceived in terms of free will? And by implication, is there some other conception of freedom that tracks what is in play or would be in play in communism?
Yeah, this is working great. Thank you. So Marx raises these criticisms of Kant, for example, and this positing of the free will as this wholly undetermined agent, right? And that, of course, is not going to be he doesn't think any of us are that, right? But I also think that while he is critical of that notion of free will, that the relationship here is that Marx is talking about the historically produced capacity of human beings to act in ways that are that represent a kind of individual, unique set of desires, perspectives, aims, right, that are less determined from the outside. And that is the piece that does touch, right, this question of free will. Because the thing that, the thing that often folks are concerned about there is they want, then you ask these questions, well, how do I, okay, maybe my will, I can do whatever it is that I will, but how's my will formed? I don't have any control over that, so on and so forth. And in that sense, Marx is talking about how is it that we could bring the formations of our will, right, of our desires, of our aims and projects more and more under our rational and conscious control. And this is the sort of thing that he has in mind when he says, for example, that revolution is necessary not only because it's the only way for the proletariat to achieve its aims as a class, but also because it's only in the course of a revolution that human beings can cast off the muck, right, of the past. There's this idea of human beings becoming their own product, right? Human beings as the objects of their own creative powers, and that being something that can be done in a more and more conscious and rational way, the more that we do it, right? and the more specifically that we make use of the capacities that we have to do it, which are themselves presented by by a whole history, right, coming down to the past that was not always sort of gone about in a conscious manner and with the aim of making human beings their own product in mind. So I go into this in other places, especially the distinction that you raised, that free will specifically. But I think the relationship there has to do with the question of the thing that sort of exercises people about free will is this notion of but can I even control that? Is there this thing that's truly spontaneous? And that issue of spontaneity, I think, is one that is addressed by a picture on which human beings over the course of history are more and more able to make decisions that have some of the character of a free will, although it's never going to be it's never going to be this fully undetermined free will, but it will increasingly be the object of human beings' own creative and rational and conscious making.
Okay. We have a stretch of at least 6 more questions, so Alec was...
Thanks very much, Vanessa. I enjoyed that very much. So I wanted to ask something about call it Marx's dialectical compatibilism. And so, I appreciate that your point of introducing this is to distinguishing it from normal compatibilism, but I wanted to begin with a worry about normal compatibilism because I'm thinking maybe it carries over, or I kind of want to know how it doesn't. So I suppose my sense, and I would imagine this is sometimes shared, is that with compatibilism, there's a deterministically determined world, and then people are like, yeah, we can fit freedom into that, and they describe something, and you're like, that isn't what I meant. And then you say, well, Marx has got a dialectical compatibilism. I'm wondering whether the same worry doesn't arise. And one way I would imagine you insisting that it doesn't arise is because you said, well, sure, freedom grows as a matter of strict law. I think you said strict law, maybe natural law. I can't remember what the formulation was.
I would accept either. So
And then I taking the dialectical part as somehow that the freedom is supposed to rebound somehow on the strictness of the law. But according to which it developed. And so I wanted to know more about how that was supposed to, like more concretely, how that's supposed to work. And I suppose in the back of my head, I'm thinking the law can't have been that strict. So isn't this just a kind of libertarian position, and that's fine?
Yeah. So thank you. So in one sense, so there's one place where the worry absolutely does carry over pretty directly, and so one of the things that I say is that in insisting upon the influence of sort of law-like historical determination on human beings, that criticizing Marx for that is criticizing him for not representing in thought something that really doesn't exist in reality either, right? So at this now. So if what we wanted was a picture of existing, it's 2023, show me that we really have these spontaneous, free, undetermined wills, then the picture that I'm giving on Marx and presenting as a reading of Marx is also going to be unsatisfactory on that grounds, right? Is not going to give you that. But I think that the desideratum is, it's like, is a person, being asked to be told like pretty lies, basically, right? And so now here's where I think the worry doesn't carry over, right? And that is precisely in this picture that I'm giving, on which one of the things that happens in those fairly law-like and determined circumstances is that we are constantly in the process of simply attempting to survive, right? Simply attempting not to be ground into dust by capitalism, we react against it, right? We form relations of solidarity. We go on strike, right? We do all kinds of things. And so the inexorability of the existential threat that's posed to us by capitalism forces us into these activities, which themselves are such as to produce this sort of blossoming, right, of our freedom and of our agency. Now, I don't think that this resolves into a libertarian position, because the laws themselves are not. The laws themselves are just observed regularities about how the things that exist interact with one another, right? And what they do. And part of what human beings do is change the facts about what the world is like, about what our social interactions are like, and so it's not surprising that the kinds of observable laws would change then, right? If we really think that it's possible to produce different relations, to abolish class, right, then of course the sorts of laws that govern a class society are going to sort of disappear, right? So I don't think that it implies, right, that there's this kind of libertarian position. If what you mean by that is the idea that that always in the past there already was this sort of like undetermined human freedom and agency. I don't think it does imply that.
Okay, Davos is.
I need to think more about my question in the light of what you just told me.
Okay.
So we have Sabine and then Alexei and then Pete.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed this talk. So I'm pretty convinced, I think, by your reading, but so let me just tell you that I think like one of my main points of resistance to a kind of Hegelian Marxist reading is thinking about this issue of historical teleology. And so I was wondering if you could maybe help me to think through it a little bit. So so I think I have kind of two related questions. So one is kind of maybe following up on Alex's question. So I was kind of wondering if you sort of follow through this this kind of dialectical reading that you're suggesting between sort of freedom and determinism. So does that then lead us to a view on which, over the course of history, kind of the unleashing of freedom also leads to more unpredictability? So actually, history kind of becomes less teleological in this sort of deterministic sense, or is that just not a direction that you want to go down? And then sort of relatedly, I was kind of thinking, so what should we do then if kind of the progress to communism, if we take communism as an actual movement and not as an ideal, as you told us to do, what do we do when the progress to communism has been stopped or stalled? It seems to me like at that juncture, it's, should we just think of the problem as a merely empirical one? So do we just need more empirical data about how to get there? Or is there a role for ethical advice at that point to sort of get us onto the right track? And I'm having trouble thinking about this without kind of any role for the ethical at all. So maybe if you could kind of,
So I'm sorry, so your first question, could you remind me of the first question again? Sorry, I got so wrapped up in the second one that.
About sort of the dialectical reading of freedom and determinism, does that lead us then to attribute like more and more unpredictability over the course of history?
I guess the most honest thing for me to say is maybe, but I don't really see. I mean, so I actually think that probably what might be most useful is to talk about teleology in the first place, maybe, because I don't think that. I think it's. So Marx is sometimes read as envisioning an end of history, and that end being communism. And I don't think that that is the best way to cash out what Marx is up to. And one reason why is that I think it probably also relies on a not great reading of what Hegel even means when he talks about this. But for Marx, he's the end of history is communism, right? He talks about the beginning of a truly human history, right, is what he has in mind. And part of why he regards it as the beginning of a truly human history is that it would be a history that human beings can more truly be said to be the authors of, right? That human beings, that it can be truly said to be the history of human beings, as opposed to what we are now all stuck in, the prehistory, right, of human beings attempting to realize that kind of agency and conscious control. Now, for Marx, the relationship between change, Marx thinks it's only possible to change the world in a rational and conscious way, and certainly in the kind of radically transformative way that is instantiated in communism, if you understand it, right? If you treat the world as though it is the sort of thing that's scientifically knowable, if you observe, right, the law-likeness of various kinds of interactions. I've also been thinking about this. Sorry, this is a quick segue, or side quest, because I've been thinking a lot about the Ocean Gate thing and the oddness of this captain of industry who hates industry, like was extremely hostile to industrialization and the others in his industry. And what did he hate about it? They kept telling him, if you do this, that is going to happen. And that's what he resented, right? And he sort of interpreted this, the claims that they know the world, that they can say what's going to happen if you bolt yourself into a tin can and sink down to the bottom of the sea. He just rejected, this sort of like positive thinking, sort of cult of positive thinking. And there's something like really essentially, so even within what we might call sort of capitalist consciousness or like bourgeois perspectives, there's a wide range, right? And there's something about that instantiates like the most degenerate reactionary sort of aspect of this kind of capitalist thinking and this reaction against, right, the most progressive elements of the bourgeoisie's impact in history, which precisely is that industrialization requires that if you're going to get something off the factory line, you have to know that if you do this, you're going to get that widget at the end, right? I think part of what Marx sees himself as doing is attempting to preserve a certain kind of scientificity, right, about our perspectives on the world, that he sees that as an important contribution of the capitalist class and of what we might call bourgeois consciousness, right, and one to be expanded upon. So there's almost a kind of transcendental argument to be made. If the world is just wildly unpredictable, then we probably are not going to succeed. We're probably all going to die, right? The sun is going to burn us all to death because we're not going to be able to produce communism unless Marx is actually right. that it's possible to know the world and to make predictions and to have an interaction with the world and with ourselves as the object of our own productive capacities that is guided by some predictability and knowability of the things that exist. And if he's wrong about that, then he's wrong about everything anyway. I think, so I think that's the answer to give there. And what was the second question?
So, if sort of the progress to communism has been stalled or stopped, then does that open up? Yeah, maybe this also responds to what you just said. Then, how do we get it going again? So, I guess the question here is Marx wrong then? Do you take him to be wrong about the predictions that he made? And then does that open up the role for ethical advice, if empirical predictions?
I can give a very short answer. So I think if it's not true that so if it turns out that actually it never does come to be the case that the international working class is able to constitute itself as a class and emancipate itself and emancipate the rest of humanity, which of course is disturbingly possible, right? That it won't happen, then we're screwed. And I think it's like a self-indulgent attempt to console ourselves, to retreat into ethics, to get away from that, right? To say, well, maybe we can, maybe they'll listen. Maybe maybe the capitalists will listen, right? Or maybe if we just figure, I don't think there's an alternative. So I'm not saying that it's an inexorable fact about the future, but what I do think is inexorable and totally certain is that only the international working class can save humanity, and if it doesn't, which it might not, then we're doomed. Yeah, sorry. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I would like to pose a question on the significance of egoism in your account, and it's related to the remark that communists do not preach morality at all. So Max Horkheimer in Egoism and the Movement of Freedom argued that the rejection of egoism in bourgeois moralities alienates human beings, and especially the proletariat, from their real concrete interests. And that, so to say, there's a rational kernel in the historical defenses of egoism, hedonism. And I would just like to know if you would agree with that, or if there's another relation that should be thought between egoism and morality.
Yeah, I think rather than egoism, I might say something like self-interestedness, perhaps. So Marx, so of the writings that posthumously are collected together into the critique of the German ideology, of course, like hundreds of those are just about Max Stirner, right, and these attacks on his egoism, and there's lots of criticisms in there. Some of them quite funny, but there's two that I'll raise for the purposes of responding to your very well posed question. Is so one kind of criticism that Marx has of this egoism is just that it's too abstract, right? That Stirner is sort of treating these different ideals as though they have a real agency that they could impose, and of course they don't, and that even the kind of ego that Stirner has in mind is this very ahistorical sort of representation. And another kind of objection that Marx raises is he says that Stirner thinks that the communists want to make sacrifices for society. And Marx responds, no, they don't. The communists want to sacrifice society, right, to themselves, right? That's the aim of the working class, is to it's not the only place where Marx is extremely adamant about the non-sacrificial nature of the cause of working class struggle. There's other places. He writes about the French novel, The Mysteries of Paris, and he gives this whole kind of literary critique of it and of this character, Marie, who is, she starts out, she's full of life, you know, and then she learns that she actually should live a life of sort of penitence and subjugating herself before God and so on. And Marx is just, how disgusting, right? How disgusting is Marx's response? And that's true pretty consistently. There's a couple places, like sometimes in some of his letters, he might say like, oh, this person made such a big sacrifice for the movement sort of offhandedly, but in his more considered moments, he's very consistent about it. And I think it's, and I think it's not that he is embracing a kind of egoism per se, but he does think that, well, first of all, that sort of call to sacrifice is usually reactionary, right, and such as to attempt to snooker working people into sacrificing themselves for capital, as it turns out. But it also is necessarily completely abstract because he's working from this conception of what human beings are, what their needs are, what it is that they're already striving at. He is looking at working class movements. He's looking at the Paris Commune, and he's observing what is the aim that's already actually inherent and implicit and realized in these existing struggles. And so his mode of operation is completely antithetical, right, to this notion of sacrifice. And it's one of the things that is sometimes pointed to as, oh, well, if he never thinks that the people to whom he addresses himself should sacrifice their interests, then he's not doing something, he's not really doing anything that's recognizable as ethical reasoning. And I guess, you know, in one sense, maybe it kind of depends what you mean by ethical, right? So, but yeah, I think it's very important to think about the centrality of interest and class interest and individual self-interest for his theory, yeah.
We have 2 more minutes and 4 more questions, so we'll be able probably to just...
I'll try to be snappier.
Yes, sorry.
I will try to go quick on this. My question is related to more practical aspects of your account on Marx's ethical vision, speaking of which I understood your Marxist ethic as a kind of meta-ethical frame that enables us to generate more individual, substantial, practical ethical practices. And then while I was listening to your talk, I was wondering what makes it hard to have this kind of ethic then? Because I think one way to answer this question could be that the classes are not only divided into 2 main classes, working classes and bourgeoisie. Within the working classes, there are a lot of subcategories, and those self-interests of each different working class go into conflict a lot of times, and I think the difficulty to build a solidarity between these classes will be one of the reasons to have this Marxist ethic, and I just want to hear your account on this, if you already have some thought on this.
So, am I right to understand the question is how can what is to be done about the sort of multiplicity of perspectives and interests within the working class, and how can ethics be a guide to doing that in some way? Okay.
That can be one sub-question of the questions that I think it could be one of the questions that could, yeah.
Okay, well, I'll try to answer that one just since we're short on time, but so the question is, or my question, not your question, but the question is about, so there's one way to answer your question, which is which makes it mainly a question of strategy, right? So if we think it's the case that the interests of humanity depend upon the victory of working class struggle, then it makes it extremely pressing to address anything that frustrates that struggle, and that makes it less likely that workers will be victorious in it. And I think that is in large part a question of politics and strategy at that point. So there's lots of, the working class might be divided by issues of racism, right, of sexism, of homophobia, and so on. And one way to address these issues is to point out how it is precisely that they frustrate the possibility of engendering the kind of solidarity that might actually address the most pressing problems of our time, right? So, and so I think that's the place where I'm saying, for example, that more importantly, that this is why why preach you don't have to preach morality to the working class, right? It's wrong to be racist, sure, right? But even more to the point, racism among the working class is completely counterproductive to the aims of the working class, and can be argued on that basis, right? That it is something that itself, right, frustrates and interferes with the goals. It's a lot harder to have a successful picket line if you're not willing to organize the people of color in your workplace, right? It's a lot harder to organize a strike if you are constantly looking down upon the women that you need to, right? Your struggle as a black woman worker, right, or as a person, as an immigrant, right, is different and looks different, right? If it's compounded, right, by this kind of identity-based oppression coming from all sides, and that's just all part of what has to be thought through and strategized around if there are going to be successful working class struggles. So I actually think this is exactly the sort of thing that is on the table when Marx says things that make it sound as though morality is simply abolished, right? And this is why I end in the talk on this note that for the working class, morality as this kind of separate set of considerations is abolished, because I think it's completely coincident with the aim of proletarian revolution. Now, at the same time, looking from the outside, it can only have the appearance of a kind of abstract or external ethical command, because it actually is completely counter to the interests of capitalism to do away with racism, for example. And so it just becomes this kind of liberal piety that it's bad to be racist. But, isn't that a shame, right? So, yeah, thank you for your question, because I think the answer, there's nothing distinctively ethical, right, from within that particular proletarian perspective. And that's part, I think, of what's missed in a lot of these conversations about Marx and ethics, right? There's a contradiction in fact, right, in reality, in how these various kinds of imperatives appear to different parts of society. To one part, they appear as the absolute preconditions of its survival. To one part, they appear as a nice piece of ethical advice about how to be a good person.
All right, we're out of time. Sorry for.
Great, thank you for your questions.
And let's thank Vanessa.